is a West African word which means storyteller. In many ways, Monica was a fierce trans storyteller. Blog Transgria was dedicated to ethical and humane reporting of victims of transphobic violence. Usually, mainstream media would focus on the victim's sexuality as opposed to the crime, dead name the victim, and re-victimize the surviving family and community. As an elder in the global trans community, I appreciated Monica and her work. I sat with this loss for some time. Then in 2021, Brandy Rodriguez, trans woman from Trinidad and Tobago, passed away. Brandy was a Trinidadian trans woman who advocated for the rights and protection of trans sex workers, people living with HIV, and trans victims of police violence. Monica, Brandy's death was also shocking. And if this is not enough, I learned that in 2022, Sandra, the person who was a recipient of one of two sex change operations performed at the Georgetown Public Hospital in the 1970s, has died. I don't know much about Sandra. I asked trans elders if her stories were documented anywhere. The answer was no. Twinkle, a trans sibling in the United States, was planning to conduct a life history interview with Sandra, but sadly, death beats us to it. Monica, Brandy, and Sandra all died during the global COVID-19 pandemic. They also died amid another pandemic, caused not by microscopic viruses or pathogens, but by humans, and fueled by ignorance, lack of empathy, misinformation, and fear. That is the global anti-gender, anti-trans pandemic, which peaked at the beginning of the 2020s. Some ways you can say that I arrived at this research topic, gender, generation, genres, a genealogy of a history of transgressive experiences and embodiments in post-colonial Guyana through law. I wanted to use my knowledge and research skills as a graduate student in interdisciplinary gender studies and my lived experiences as a Guyanese trans person to document the life stories of our elders and to honor those who came before us. And so here I am with this research project. I want to acknowledge that the Caribbean region has seen 2 decades of scholarship and research on transgressive sexualities and gender, tracing earliest contributions such as Gloria Wecker's seminal anthropological study, Mati work in 1997 and published in 2006, to more recent additions to the field such as Gishowan's erotic cartographies and Nikolai Attai's defiant bodies. No doubt, this body of scholarship is significant in bringing attention to the absences and silences of gender and sexual transgressive voices and representations in Caribbean history, historiography, and social sciences. While I build on this existing body of scholarship, my point of departure from the literature relates to 2 gaps: population gap and country-specific gap. We do not have studies, empirical research, or sexuality studies conducted in the context of Guyana, queer and trans elders, that is people who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. Most of the current research that we have is related to HIV, gender-based violence, and discrimination, and oftentimes the sample size would include relatively young people. And so there is a gap in the body of gender and sexuality scholarship about the lived experiences of an aging trans and queer generation. So the problem, so when you do research, you're often told that the lack of something is not a problem. What the lack of something results in, that is the problem. So because we do not have lived experiences of our queer and trans elders documented, that lack of attention and documentation of their life story results in a lack of a transgressive genealogy or history, and that in turn creates an epistemic gap or knowledge gap. which in turn results in the absences or losses of community memory, invisibility of transgressive moments in our history, silences and occlusion of transgressive moments from the Caribbean social and historical landscape. So we're dealing with larger issues here, more than the lack of documentation of these stories. It's how the lack of documentation results in the loss of our community memory and the erasure and invisibility of queer and transgressive elders from Guyana's social and historical landscape. So to address this problem, I came up with two aims of the study. And the first is to gain a better understanding of how transgressive Guyanese imagined and experienced their intimate selves in the post-colonial context of the 1970s and 1980s. And the second aim of this research is to explore how such understanding of selfhood might help us to generate ideas to inform our current approaches to decolonize sexualities, engage in collective healing justice, and trans and queer liberation. For measurable outcomes of this research, which are the objectives, there are 4 objectives. The first is to conduct life history interviews with 10 to 15 transgressive Guyanese aged 50 years and older to document how transgressive Guyanese understood and experienced their gender and sexual selves in the post-colonial context, to analyze and synthesize their life history interviews along with archival materials to construct a transgressive genealogy, and finally, to use all of this information to formulate recommendations based on the findings to help activists and communities develop strategies for collective healing justice and decolonizing sexualities. There are 3 main research questions that are guiding my study and that will guide data collection. And these questions are: how did post-colonial transgressive subjects imagine and experience their intimate selves within a specific context? Their understanding of selfhood inform our present struggles for gender justice, collective healing justice, decolonizing sexualities, and trans and queer liberation? And how can we create intergenerational dialogues to advance our approaches to decolonizing gender and sexualities? So far in my presentation, I've been using certain terms repeatedly: transgressive experiences, embodiment. The main research question is: how did post-colonial transgressive subjects imagine and experience their intimate selves in a specific concept? So because I am using these terms consistently, they are part of what is my conceptual framework. And the conceptual framework is where I outline how these main concepts and terms are related to each other and how they interact with each other. It's outlining the relationship that these concepts have, and also the expectations, or my expectation as the researcher, of how they interact and what they produce when they interact with each other. And so transgressive is a key term that I've been using in my research, and I want to take the opportunity to define what I mean when I use the term transgressive. So when I use the term transgressive, I'm guided here by Rosamund King, C. Riley Snorton, Dr. Nikolai Attai's very own work in Defiant the Body. And so for me, transgressive refer to acts, behaviors, or experiences that trouble or defy the sex and gender binary and heterosexuality. In other words, these are experiences that challenge societal norms, particularly in relation to, quote unquote, normative sexuality and gender. Transgressive experiences or behaviors may include same-sex desiring experiences, cross-dressing, gay men or same-sex loving men with feminine gender expression, masculine presenting queer or same-sex loving women, trans sex workers, trans mothers, frog whores, anti-man, femme, coxswain, and people who do not conform to heterosexual or normative genders. And so that is how I define transgressive in the study. And so when I talk about documenting the life stories of transgressive elders, I'm talking about people 50 years and older who may use some of these terms that I just stated here, like trap whores, anti-man, queer, gay, lesbian. It's basically people who do not conform to normative heteronormativity and heterosexuality. Similarly, I defined experience as a complex interplay between the sensual, the cognitive, and the bodily experience that we have within the social environment. Embodiment, this concept is guided by Nixon and King's definition, coming from their embodied theories that talked about the importance of the emotional and material dimension of the body and how experiences are manifested through the materiality of the body. And intimacy is guided by Stoller and Scheller, talking about interbodily encounter and not necessarily intimacy in relation to just the sexual, but in relation to platonic, sensual, spiritual, interbodily experiences that we have with each other. So I know this is a lot of academic and probably technical jargons I'm using, so it's just finding the concepts that are key to my research. On the literature review that I would have conducted and engaging with the material, I've realized that narrative inquiry methodology would be the most appropriate methodology for me to apply in this research. And this is because aim is to document the life stories of queer and trans elders, and narrative inquiry does exactly that in 3 dimensions. This methodology looks at time, space, and sociality. So time, in the context of my research, is considered non-linear. The past is not the past, the present, and the future. Everything is bounded up in one, and that is how we sometimes define our identity, by looking back into the past, taking into consideration the present, and constantly defining and redefining who we are. Space is defined in terms of intimacy, and as I shared earlier in the previous slide, guided by Stoller and Scheller's definition of intimacy, which is relations of proximity and familiarity. And sociality is a series of inter-embodiment encounter. That is how we interact with others, whether it's a dyadic relationship or it's in a group setting, and how others interact with us to shape our experiences. From the narrative inquiry methodology, there are 4 specific methods for data collection in my research. Life history interview, memory work, archival engagement, and oral history. The life history interview is where I'm going to gather the bulk of information for my study. I'll be conducting life history interviews with community members 50 years and older who would have had transgressive experiences to document their life story or their genealogy growing up in the 70s and 80s. Tell me about your childhood, for example. Who was your first crush? How did you explore your sexualities in the 70s and 80s when there was no organized LGBTIQ movement or organizations that were present in Guyana? Memory work, similar to life history interview, involves participants sharing, it could be photograph, an item, or a story from their past, and to really reflect on what that item or photograph evokes, the memory. Archival engagement is also part of the data collection process, but I'm very mindful that colonial archives usually reflect the interest of those who are in power. And oftentimes when you find queer and trans stories in the archives, they are not written from the standpoint or the perspective of the queer or trans person. They're usually written by the colonial officials in ways that demoralize and stigmatize and pathologize transgressive experiences in history. And finally, oral history is really to bring the life history interviews, the memory work, and the archival engagement together and to situate the individual life history interview into the broader social and political Guyanese history. So these are the methods of data collection for my study. A little bit about the details of data collection. The research will be conducted in Guyana, which is a natural setting. I'll be focused on 4 administrative regions because of accessibility and cost. So it would be, those regions would be region 3, 4, 5, and 6. However, I will consider using Zoom or other online platform to conduct life history interviews with persons who may be outside of these 4 regions. The sample size, I'm looking to interview 10 to 15 Guyanese, 50 years and older who have transgressive experiences. All data will be collected at one point in time. The time frame is about 2 months. The estimated budget for my study is $6,000 US, and sponsorship or grant, it's none. It's self-funded study. This is my ambitious timeline. I was supposed to be engaging in data collection from the 3rd of June. However, we are in July and I'm still in Trinidad. But I've already received ethics approval from the university. I'm hoping to be in Guyana by the end of this week to start collecting data. I have some potential participants already interested in the study. I actually spoke to someone yesterday who is 70 years old and is a lesbian woman. And I was really excited because the oldest person on my list of potential participants is a 56-year-old trans woman, and to talk with somebody who is 70 years old, like, I'm really excited to hear the stories of this person. Like, they briefly share over the phone, you know, as a teenager, I had girlfriend and I had relationships. So, like, imagine like the stories that this person has. So, after data collection, I'm hoping to submit my thesis by the end of October, fingers crossed. And with that, I'm finished with my degree at UWI. I have 2 conclusions. Why not? So the first conclusion is that I want to acknowledge that what I'm doing is not something new. We do have queer and transgressive stories in the colonial archives in Guyana, and those of you in media would probably know of the sex change operation story when it was published. What is it? Tales from Way Back When. And then there's a story of a man in miniskirt sent for psychiatric treatment. There's stories in the colonial archive of people being in prison for sodomy or buggery. So transgressive experiences, whether it's sexual or gender transgression, it's not something new. And I think that is what we are hearing, that, oh, it's something new, it's something that is imported from the US. No. The archives information about transgressive stories, but as I shared earlier also, these stories are often written from the perspectives of the colonial official. So that is why I'm engaging in life history interviews for persons with the lived experiences to tell their stories. The second conclusion is a concluding reflection from Dr. Nikolai Attai's book, Defiant Body. And this is a call that Dr. Attai invites us to really pay attention to and to intervene. And I quote here, "The experiences captured in this book, Defiant Bodies, demonstrate the need for us to intervene and disrupt such popular narratives of queerness and call attention to the silence, not silent, and untold stories of resilience and resistance enacted by queer and trans people." So his call for us to intervene and to disrupt this popular narrative, I believe that one of the popular narratives that we are hearing is that queer or queerness and transness, these are ideological colonization and cultural imperialism from the West, especially in the climate of anti-gender, anti-trans that we are seeing. We're hearing oh, this thing about trans and non-binary and queer, these are all Western imports. They're coming from Europe and America. And so I believe the work that I'm engaging in as a novice researcher and scholar is helping to disrupt this narrative that queerness and transness, they're not something that has been part of Caribbean history and historiography. And so by engaging in life history interviews and oral history, I'm able to document the stories of our elders and to say, hey, we were trans before the term trans, and we were queer before the term queer, and we were here before the term LGBTIQ. And so this is where I situate my current research, in intervening and disrupting that narrative of queerness and transness as being external and part of cultural imperialism. And I'll end here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Alessandra. I'll just ask if there are any questions or comments for you. Glad to see you back on camera. Yes, German, if somebody could get a mic to German.
Hi, Alexandra. Thanks for your presentation. Actually, I was taken a little aback when you started to use some new terms. I hear the word coxswain in a long time. But I think how you ended took me back to those terminologies, and I don't know if your research instrument, you could tease out those word origins. Because now we do use the LGBTI terms, and some of those old terms, people celebrate them now, right? So when people call you, oh, she's a old coxswain, it's a big dirty laugh, and people now wear it as a badge of honor somewhat. And these Western terms, people cringe a lot because it creates a lot of uncomfortableness. So it'd be good to tease out those word origins and genesis, because they're part of our identity as too, because I remember one time I was traveling overseas and I hear somebody use a term. I said, that's the Guyanese. So, in Guyana, if you hear that term, you say, there's a Guyanese. In Barbados, they say, look, he's a buller. So you don't know that. And I think it's good in terms of constructing the identity as Guyanese when it comes to the question of trans. I don't know if you could explain to me, because the interesting thing with research is terminology. What is decolonizing sexualities? If you can explain that a little more to me, because it's a very interesting term or concept, and I think I might have an indication of what it is, but so it would be good to know from your academic perspective, what does that mean? Thank you.
Thanks for your questions, Jermaine.
Sure,
you got it clearly, Ali?
For your questions. You're going to take more questions, Joel, or let me respond?
I think you could go with those two. Yeah, go with those two.
Okay, great. So that's an excellent point you make of teasing out culturally specific gender and sexuality terminologies. Like, I remember learning about frock whore, and what my older trans siblings told me is that in the early 1990s, when we weren't using the term transgender in Guyana, you had a split of between the sex workers. So you had sex workers, assigned male at birth sex workers who were wearing pants, and then you had assigned male at birth sex workers who start showing up in frocks and skirts. And so that caused a tension between the two, and the pants were always thought that the frock were thought that they were better because they were able to quote unquote live their true selves by wearing frock. And so that is why I decided to add that term frock whore. I also decided to add like coxswain, dyke, and so in the research, but there is a specific question that is going to tease out culturally specific and relevant terminology. So one of the questions is, were you aware of other people who had transgressive experiences while growing up? What were the terms used to describe people with those experiences? And so it's helped me to also capture terms that I might not be aware of. So definitely that is going to be captured in the research. Regarding your question about what does decolonizing sexuality mean? So Caribbean sexuality scholars like Kempadu, you have Pretty on the call here, Nikolai Attai, my thesis advisor, Dr. Angelique Nixon. We have been calling to decolonize sexuality. And what we basically mean is to think about sexuality and gender outside of a colonial framework And that means to move beyond the Caribbean as being hypersexual and promiscuous, because oftentimes when we are viewed from Western perspective, our sexualities and genders are often described as people who are hypersexual and promiscuous. And so to decolonize Caribbean sexuality, or to decolonize sexualities and gender, means that we have to move beyond that Western frame, and we have to take into consideration genders and sexual diversities that are outside of the colonial binary matrix of this is what it means to be male, this is what it means to be female, and you have to fit neatly into these boxes. Decolonizing sexualities and gender is also acknowledging that before colonialism, that there were diverse ways of being in some societies, and that colonialism really enforced a binary gender system that erased those diverse ways of being. So it's really going back to the root and centering indigenous and post-colonial people ways of knowing and being, and allowing them to interpret and define their genders and sexualities outside of Western terminologies, outside of Western paradigms. And that is why throughout my research, I avoid using the term LGBTIQ, because I know LGBTIQ emerged within a Euro-American vocabulary, and some older people may not use that term LGBTIQ. Hope I was able to answer that.
I think you did. Is Jeremy satisfied with the answer? Yes. Any other questions or comments for Alessandra? No, it doesn't appear so. Thank you so much, Ali. And I noted your ambitious timelines for completing your research, and that you might actually be done in October. That would be really exciting if we could hear from you on October 17th when we launch Dr. Kumar's book here in Georgetown. So fingers crossed that all goes according to plan. All right. And finally, we're going to have Dr. Nastasia Rambaran, who is a Guyanese Barbadian. That's how I'm describing her now. Now she got a people passport as well. A Guyanese Barbadian, medical doctor, researcher, writer, consultant, who just completed a PhD in sociology at the University of Glasgow. And in her work, she has done a comparative study between Guyana and Barbados, her two homes, looking at queer activism, decolonial processes, and transnational issues in the two places. I think today, because of the focus of this symposium commemorating SASOT's Guyana's 21st anniversary, her presentation for today's purpose will focus primarily on Guyana and interrogate the work that we have done, not just as SASOT, but as the Guyanese movement over the last couple of decades. So without further ado, I think I'm going to need Jaffrey's help with the tech. Let me hand over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Nastasia Rambaran, for her presentation.
Thanks, Daryl. I'm going to wait until I can see the presentation up, but I know I'm the only thing standing between everybody and lunch. So I'll try to keep this succinct. Fantastic. Wait.
All right. In your case, Nas, we are projecting for you and doing the slides for you, so we can get full screen, right?
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
Seeing it on my screen, so all right, you can go ahead. All right, yeah, just keep it on the cover page. So hi again, everybody. As Joel just did a great job explaining, this will be kind of an extract from my PhD thesis. And it really concentrates on queer activism in Guyana and gives a historical sociological analysis that is still kind of abbreviated. It doesn't cover everything I would have researched, but I think it's kind of pertinent for today. So next slide. The thesis used multiple methods. It draws heavily, but for some of this, especially the historical part, it draws heavily on archival sources, namely the newspapers and the SASAD Yahoo groups. I also used interviews with activists, and this was supplemented by online research and some autoethnographic detail. Next slide. So today I'll be concentrating on the early years of organizing in Guyana, which primarily centers around SASAD Guyana's activities, doing a brief sketch of the trajectory of queer activism and then talking a little bit about movement dynamics in Guyana. So I just put this figure here so that you can get an idea of how queer organizations expanded throughout the timeline from 2001 to 2022. And as you can see, there was an expansion and there were more organizations in 2022 than in 2001. Along the way, some of these also became defunct. Next slide. All right, so in thinking of the early years of organizing, from 2001 to 2010, there were already 7 organizations catering to LBQ persons in Guyana. Then SASA splashed onto the scene in a very public way with the 2003 constitutional reform, and then had an inaugural 2005 film festival, and then subsequently maintained a very high profile in the local media with its advocacy. SASAD, in terms of framing, SASAD wielded a human rights framing from the inception. The most common framing in the early years were human rights and anti-discrimination, followed by anti-violence and freedom claiming. The latter framing was almost always twinned with international and legal articles like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, while anti-violence was often implicit in the noting of the violent toll of discrimination. There was also framings around dignity, privacy, and equality, but these were infrequent. And decolonization was never mentioned early on during that period. Prioritizing a human rights framing was unsurprising, as founder Joel Simpson revealed it was his academic interest in human rights during Guyanese law school that prompted his attendance at the first 2003 public discussion. And then if you listen to the recordings of the speeches at the 2003 Parliamentary Forum that the group held, this focus was also evident. Years later, 2 of SASA's earliest events also centered around International Human Rights Day and included the public distribution of posters and pamphlets on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Another important transnational connection was the SASAD Film Festival, which Rowley pointed out captured the veil by carving out queer space within Guyanese culture while maintaining a transnational bond to the transnational film circuit. Started as a quote-unquote whimsical challenge to provide educational entertainment, the festival turned out to be a non-threatening gateway with extensive reach. This was evidenced by its long run and how the IRO condemnation in 2010 was actually challenged by several newspaper columnists and editors who noticed its value. Then in 2006 to 2008, SASAD was represented at several prominent international conferences and had a lot of contact and support for transnational organizations. But these engagements were not always tension-free. For example, in 2007, when it was suggested that local groups should call for an apology from homophobic singers, a Yahoo group member replied that apologies were not a local priority, but an imposition of the international activist agenda. And then in 2008, with concerns around local activists being linked to the UK NGO Outrage, call for riots at concerts of homophobic artists was not something that was necessarily supported by SASAD. In terms of networking and intersections, early SASAD in-person meetings were held at the Help and Shelter office, and then over time, other NGO offices, cafes, clubs, restaurants, and private residences around Georgetown and in Region 3. The availability of several, sometimes publicly high-profile venues during this time was indicative of some level of support and networking within private and civil society. The print media was also fairly supportive during this time. There were some other notable partnerships with other NGOs such as GAIBO and the Guyana Human Rights Association. And then from 2006 onwards, SACID started being more intersectional in their activities, tackling issues apart from LGBTQ plus human rights. It was a reverse of the Caribbean trend, which was generally from HIV to human rights. For SACID, HIV became more prominent in discussion over the latter years. In fact, the organization received its first major funding in January 2007 from the government of Guyana to develop Spectrum Health Net for HIV education. Ironically, this meant the first funder was also the one the organization had essentially been formed to lobby, which was the government of Guyana, a point that did not escape Vidyarati Kithoon's notice. A significant intersection during SACID's history was religion. Religion and spirituality-based activities probably had the longest running thread of continuity within the organization, as the very first in-person discussions held when the organization regrouped in 2005 was titled Reconciling Spirituality and Sexuality. Early discussions centered religions imposed and imported by colonialism, such as Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam. Atheism was also included in sometimes, but indigenous religions, so those practiced by enslaved and indentured ancestors, and those formed in the region, such as Obi and Budon and Rastafarianism, were not given space. After collaboration with Jamaica's Sunshine Cathedral, the focus in spirituality centered Christianity, but at some point then returned to a slightly more diverse perspective. As in recent years, every Pride Month has also included interfaith sessions for the predominant religions in Guyana. Next slide. So based on some of this analysis, as well as other analysis, and as well the work in Barbados, I formulated that the trajectory of queer activism, which of course had occurred for decades and maybe even centuries outside of formal organizations, the trend can be characterized as early HIV-focused organizations, such as Artists in Direct Support, that incorporated varying levels of attention to the queer community. In 10 years, the first organization to explicitly address LGBTQ+ rights emerged. Then from 2010s, the arc has been one of diversification, amplification, and increasing visibility. There was a moderate divergence in activism between Barbados and Guyana, and that was traced to geographical size and political environments, which are in turn linked to colonialism and transnationalism to some degree. Next slide. Okay, so movement dynamics, it's a lot. So I just selected some of pertinent or interesting information, I think, for today's presentation. Early on, while the SACID Film Festival has been described as a useful and needed queer space, it was also characterized as upper-crust pseudo-intellectual experimentations with the half-hearted posturing. This raised valid questions around accessibility and classism, because while the festival has always been free and had variably appealing subject matter, the venues were mostly frequented by upper and middle class people and would attract a similar crowd along with certain expectations of dress and having to patronize the bar. So this was perhaps unsurprising given SACID's student genesis. Kithoon has favorably presented this fact, referring to the founders as scholar activists following the footsteps of Walter Rodney, who made university knowledge relevant to everyday life. But in a country where only approximately 10% of the adult population has post-secondary or university degree from 2012, the founders and many of the members of SACID, however, represent a small portion of Guyanese. In Guyana, where class is associated with occupation and education, amongst other factors, higher levels of education can translate to higher class. So these class biases were also reflected in many of the early activity choices after the film festival. There were events held such as poetry readings, literature readings, book launch, book club, letter writings. And it wasn't until December 2006 that SACID held its first party, which would have appealed to a wider cross-section of the LGBTQ plus community. Based on the interviews with activists, these class issues have continued to influence activism and were noted to be a reflection of prevailing societal divisions. The cultural capital accorded to higher class persons was mentioned, this time in relation to securing funding and taking advantage of political opportunities. So Equal and SACID were singled out as being bougie. In SACID's case, especially catering to upper class gay men, Equal was noted as focused on cultivating allyships, which sometimes explain the class biases in their structure and membership. Class differences were also apparent between the organizations, with GAIBO or other grassroots organizations being equated with low class and not given respect by middle class organizations. Trans persons were at the lowest end of the class hierarchy, and so, as Lorna said, certain people don't see themselves, they don't want to align themselves with trans work, so the trans movement has always been pushed aside. There's class within the work. One interviewee mentioned that this recognition during the time of organizing around the cross-dressing case actually contributed to the formation of GTU. Several persons noted that class privilege can lead to blind spots in representation and the need to bridge these class divides. And moving on to about gender. Issues around gender representation occurred early in the movement. SACID Yahoo group showed disconnects with the trans community and minimized involvement of cis women. Representation of women remained suboptimal within the group, and this resulted in the reorienting within the movement, and this resulted in the reorienting of GAIBO's mission, SWAC's formation, and trans organizations, which are dominated by trans women. Similarly, there were also reports of trans people feeling tokenized in the broader activist spaces. Kamar, who we heard from earlier today, has also noted a geographical element to gendered considerations, with queer women in more rural areas, such as Berbice, being unaware of and disconnected from the organizing taking place in Georgetown. Now moving on to ethnicity, despite the well-known inter-ethnic friction that exists in Guyana, 5 of 17 Guyanese activists denied that ethnicity significantly factored into queer activism. However, others noted that the influence of ethnicity in the movement reflects wider Guyanese society, and they noticed that it might be increasing since 2015. Apart from these emerging splits, another characteristic was the perception of the movement as being Afro-Guyanese dominated. To illustrate this point, one interviewee points out how the main organizations, such as SACID, GTU, and GAIBO, as well as the litigants in the cross-dressing case, were mainly Afro-Guyanese. While the organizations vary in terms of ethnicity of the leadership, for example, an activist characterized SACID and GTU as Afrocentric, proud to be trans and equal as Indocentric, and GAIBO, in fact, as more mixed. However, of course, these characterizations depend on what you're using to measure them, because it could depend on whether they're talking about leadership or whether they're talking about membership. And for example, with SACID, where there is an ethnically diverse staff, frequent staff turnover meant people equated organizational leadership with the long-standing director and founder, who's Afro-Guyanese, with predominantly Afro-Guyanese social network. Also, the attendees of SACID events also skew towards Afro-Guyanese persons. But you have to take into consideration all these factors, the fact that most organizations were located in Region 4, and especially Capital 1. So obviously organizational membership can be expected to follow a similar pattern. There were 2 other major themes around ethnicity, and one was the exclusion of indigenous people, which other people have spoken about before, and the comparatively infrequent involvement of Indo-Guyanese in the movement, which not a lot of persons have spoken about in the literature. The relative dearth of Indo-Guyanese within the movement can be ascribed to reasons more internal to the Indo-Guyanese communities, such as sometimes Hindu communities are seen as being more accepting of non-normative genders and sexualities. But this comes with the cost that the sexuality or gender identity should not be prominently flaunted. So that means they can then be very visibly associated with activism. Another factor at play is anti-Blackness within the Indo-Guyanese community. And interestingly, one interview revealed that there's stigmatization around activism and its urban location, especially for trans persons. As they said, going to Georgetown was associated with sex work, inevitable HIV infection, and loss of any employment and acceptance within rural communities. So this therefore prevented in-depth networking with the activism hubs in the capital. There were factors also more external to the Indo-Guyanese community, which included lack of cultural accommodations and feeling intimidated by the composition of the movement. In terms of Indigenous exclusion, which other scholars have commented on before, including Nikolai, it's not to say that Indigenous people have been absent within the movement, as Gaibo, Equal, Comforting Hearts, and Proud to be Trans have had both Indigenous members and or leaders. But the relative exclusion of Indigenous persons was still a significant theme. One reason for this was Indigenous communities have different priorities and a complex relationship claiming rights through the state. Several activists also mentioned the homophobia and taboo around queerness prevalent in Indigenous communities, which, as Carmen pointed out, exacerbates the disconnect as queer Indigenous people leave their communities to come to town and live their life. And this eventually skews towards more bigotry as the more bigoted people remain in Indigenous communities. The practical reason for exclusion is the sheer size of the country. Minimal interior infrastructure makes it cost prohibitive to build connection with Indigenous communities. Equal at the time was one of the only organizations that had done activities with communities in the interior. And when asked how inclusion could be improved, activists were divided. A couple noted that there's a need to balance any outreach to these communities with possible harm. However, activists with linkages to the Indigenous communities saw a need for urgency and necessity to reaching out to these communities. Peters in 2019 had findings that echoed the difficulties connecting with Indigenous communities and suggesting that putting outreach in a more general sexual reproductive health term gain more purchase. But while this would increase awareness around the issues and the organization, it's unlikely to entirely overcome the logistical issues of mobilizing across the distances. In terms of movement fragmentation, there were positive descriptors of the movement in Guyana, such as vocal, picking up speed, resilient, diverse. But several activists also noted the movement was fragmented, separated, segregated, or sad, selfish, and fearful. Competitiveness was also mentioned, and it was also noted that it happened between various organizations, most notably between SASOD and Gaibo, and between GTU and Artisan Direct Support. Two interviewees noted these conflicts affected constituent recruitment and other sources of support because it confused potential local supporters about which organizations they support, and sometimes it resulted in the movement not being taken seriously. There was also a siloing of effort noted by several persons, but this was not necessarily detrimental because concentrating on each organization's calling could help streamline the work. But the challenge remained a lack of overall engagement between organizations. The literature said that fragmentation and diversification can occur due to factors internal and external to the movement. There's been an attempt to form a coalition that could provide cohesive, centralized leadership. That was initially around Pride, but this did not continue. There were also ideological differences that have played a part in fragmentation, taking the form of disagreements on accountability or transparency. More notably, the Guyanese movement was further along the fragmentation end of the spectrum, and the cleavages were along pre-existing social fault lines by way of class, race, and gender differences. Interviewees allowed room for personality-based changes, histories of distrust, disrespect, lack of boundaries, and power plays that come with increased visibility and funding also factored in these divisions. As Leela explained, there were deep conflicts within the organizations which could not be transformed because they were not based on differences of views, but on class, power, etc. Issues of gender and class both enter the equation in conflicts with GIBO and GTU, as these organizations cater to women and mostly trans women respectively, and attracted a predominantly lower socioeconomic status of constituents. There were also external factors that led to fragmentation, and these include resource constraints leading to intense competition. And while some scholars assert that fragmentation implies the death of the movement, this is not necessarily the case. The movement dynamic, therefore, does not necessarily portend its demise, but it's a concerning feature that deserves attention. As Guyanese activist Rishi said, I find it very unfortunate and disturbing that we are unable, as activists and leaders of these organizations that have been established to serve all these different purposes, it's very disturbing and unfortunate that we find it so hard to work together. Next slide. Conclusion, this curated presentation of the early days of organizing, the trajectory of queer organizing in Guyana, and then a more contemporary look at selected movement dynamics was presented. In thinking of considerations around class, gender, ethnicity, and indigeneity, we can note the colonial origins and post-independence continuation of respectability politics, the privileged middle-class movement representation, and the gender binaries and hierarchies that hinder trans and women participation. Similarly, colonial extensions have resulted in complex socio-political interplays that see the exclusion of indigenous populations and proportionately decreased participation of Indo-Guyanese persons. The emergence of the significant theme around movement diversification or fragmentation further emphasizes the role of collective identity, as these fissures were also related to class, ethnicity, gender, and histories of interaction. And that's it. I think I did a good job making this short. Thank you.
I think you did. Thanks very much, Naz. It was a very good presentation, quite comprehensive for the timeline that you covered. We're going to open up the floor for a couple of questions for you before we close. Anyone has any questions or comments on Nastasia's presentation? Moses, I haven't heard you for the morning. That's very unusual. All right. Anyone else? It was either super, super clear or it went over everybody's heads because you haven't managed to provoke a question or comment in this room. Or it might be that we're on the 12 noon mark and everybody's ready to go to lunch.
I'm hoping that's it. Everybody just has.
Anything from you, Colin? No. Yeah, hold on. I want to get you so we can get you. We're live streaming as well. So this is Colin Crowley from Go. Mm-hmm.
Good day. You're pretty accurate in saying Guyana's forest peoples have been excluded in just about everything, actually. They're struggling for recognition. At a very personal level, I've been trying to encourage young people to try and break away from these colonial yokes that they've been oppressing them for the last 500 plus years, from missionaries, from the churches, the politicians, just about everybody have been keeping them down all these years, and they really need to self-liberate. And certainly we can empathize with this decolonial term. You know, and it's nice to have Mr. Joel Simpson as a member of our Facebook group. I think he's been noticing some comments about the word decolumbusization, decolonization, etc. So we share these struggles with the LGBT folks. And I have to say, if it were not for GEF and GOIP piggybacking on that umbrella body, we may not have been able to get our words out. So I'm saying that networking is going to be very useful, right? I've been struggling to get our, homosexual, even that word, and that's a problematic word. We don't use the word Amerindian, by the way. Those are all Columbus misnomers. I like Bok people. To come out in the open and say, you know, we need acceptance. I am familiar with several gay and lesbian indigenous peoples, especially young ones, but they're hiding. You know, they're scared to come out in the open. They're being kept down by their families. They're just unacceptable just by about everybody. So it's quite a very difficult situation that they're in. So I have to say thanks a lot to Sasot, the main organization in the GEF, for playing a role in trying to break this yoke. So it has been quite a learning experience. All three presentations were all fantastic. I actually invited some other indigenous persons to come, but I could predict they weren't going to come because they met to hear about anti-man and anti-woman, gay and lesbian. They say, oh God, we don't want to be part of that. One last comment. In indigenous females, there's a very unacceptable practice of calling an indigenous woman who chose not to have children or for some reason is not fertile as a lesbian. I don't know if this applies to non-indigenous communities in Guyana also, but I've personally found this very obnoxious. And what this does, it forces indigenous women to go and make a child to prove she's not a lesbian. So all these things we're struggling against. It's quite a huge struggle when it comes to indigenous people. That's all I got to say. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Colin. That's the first time I've heard that. Thanks for that contribution. Nas, any reactions?
Thank you so much, Colin. I absolutely agree. And I did look at, in another part of the thesis, the fact that the GEF is now trying to, make connections with indigenous communities and populations. I think the LGBTQ plus movement needs to do some more work in that regard. We've started, but it definitely needs to be a bit more intersectional, reaching across the other kinds of movements and getting on board with indigenous rights movements as well. But yeah, I agree. And also, like Joel, is the first time I've heard of that. This of calling the women lesbians. But yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah. And for me, that's lesbophobia because, that's how it operates, Yeah. Any other closing questions or comments? I don't see any. So on that note, I want to thank especially the people in this room for sticking it out to the end. I know we said it's a two-part event. The media was primarily interested in the book launch, and I didn't have like a very clear break because I wanted to manage the time. So thank you very much for coming. People that I did recognize at the beginning, I want to recognize now. Honorable Member of Parliament who's here with us, former Mayor and Pandit, our colleagues from the international sector, recognize the Canadian High Commission, the US Embassy, the Pan American Development Foundation, and by extension, the EU delegation. Also my colleagues here from the GEF as well, who both spoke and had comments and so on as well. Oh, the British High Commission's right here at front. You blended in so nicely, I didn't even remember you. So thank you all very much for coming. Please make sure that you put your contact details down on the sign-in sheet because you will get an e-copy of the book and the PowerPoint presentations that were delivered here today. So you could at least reference those. We've also been live streaming on multiple social media platforms. It's probably easiest to find the live stream on Facebook and YouTube. I think we were on Twitter and LinkedIn as well. So even if you missed it or you want to listen back to the presentations, you can have that reference as well. And when we do share the e-copy of Nikolai's book and the PowerPoints, we'll include the YouTube link as well. So you have that for future reference. Thank you all very much for coming. We really do appreciate it on this rainy Tuesday morning. And I hope you have a great rest of the day and the rest of the week.